Hello guys, this is Sean from Sean's World, and I just wanted to let you know that we are doing another interview, and I've had so much fun with the last one. I thought, why not set up another one? And this time we have Professor David Bunn, and he's going to be here to talk about conservation and communities and all of the amazing different ways that those two can interact. So, first, what I'd like to ask you is tell us about yourself.
Well, first, Sean, I'd like to thank you for letting me do this interview. I feel very honored. We've had a great time together already over this past term working together. And I have a checkered and complicated history, so you must just stop me at some point. But essentially, I started off in South Africa. I am a South African as a young anti-apartheid activist and also someone who worked in cultural studies and literature. And then over many years, I morphed into someone who worked more in environmental history, and then more and more on some of the practical applications of new ideas of conservation and communities. And with that latter change of direction, for the past decade, for the past 20 years in fact, I've been working in an area of South Africa which is very rural. It's the extreme northeast of South Africa, and working especially with communities, the 2 million people or so who are living alongside the western edge of the Kruger National Park, one of Africa's largest game reserves. And I also directed the largest research, I was the research director of the largest game reserve in academic game reserve in South Africa, called Wits Rural Facility. So I learned to experience a lot of the contradictions around communities and conservation firsthand. And that was until 2 years ago, at which point my wife and I moved to Colorado to take up positions at Colorado State University. Yes.
So, along with that, can you tell us about some of the work you've done along with conservation or towards conservation?
I think that maybe I should start with a little anecdote. That I've always had this dream. And it dates back to when I first went to the Kruger National Park in South Africa as a child, and that was when I was 5 years old. And it was a place that moved me tremendously. It was a place that I found to be quite contradictory, because in those days it was a kind of racialized environment. Only whites were allowed. So that made a big impact on me in those years. But I had a dream from my earliest years that goes something like this. I'm sitting in a hut, around what we would call a rondel, a round hut, and I dream that I wake up and an animal has broken in through the mosquito-screened door and is moving towards the bed. It's a hyena, and it's padding towards the bed on its soft feet, and my mother can't save me and my father can't save me. So that kind of fear, it sounds negative, but in fact it's an index of how deeply the communication with nature, natural environments, and African mammals imprinted itself upon me from a very early age. And I've spent my whole life working on Savannah, Africa, working on issues of conservation, writing about how conservation and the Savannah is represented, but then in later years, in a very practical way, working with communities who are coming up with innovative solutions to really wicked problems of conservation. That's a broad answer, but I can be more specific if you like.
That's fine. Here at CSU, you lead a study abroad program about communities and conservation practices. What are some of the goals of this trip, and what do you want students to take away from it?
Again, let me answer that by a little lateral arabesque, as they say in ballet. I've led many study abroad programs in my life. I have either managed or co-managed at least 15 in my life, including programs for Harvard, University of Chicago, Arizona State, Northwestern, a whole lot of others. I currently am involved with 4. But the CSU, Colorado State University program, is very different to all of the others I've run. And what it will do is take students on a long loop from the base that I used to run. And I'm doing this in direct partnership with my wife, who's the co-leader of this study abroad, the brilliant Professor Melissa McHale, urban ecologist. So we I'll switch to the plural. We take students from the research base that I used to direct, which is our home base, on this long looping adventure in which we will look at some of the most innovative experiments in communities and conservation in post-apartheid South Africa. So we will go into areas that tourists don't have access to. Within the gigantic Kruger National Park, we'll have an amazing time seeing animals, getting close to them, under conditions which are safe, but thrilling. And we will stay at research bases. We will meet some of the leading conservation biologists, savanna biologists in the world, friends of ours who work within the national park system in South Africa and globally. And we will visit a number of different community projects. One of them is one that I helped to establish 20 years ago, and which now is focused on the work of young environmentalists. There's a United Nations sponsored environmental monitor program which operates up there. It's in a village, an area called Hamakuya, literally on the Zimbabwe border in the north. So we'll go there, spend time in local villages. And the essential goal of the program is to introduce students to the idea that the conservation, especially of charismatic mammals, which is what everyone wants to see in Africa. You want to see a lion, you want to see the big five, all of that stuff, is really not possible and has no future without innovation in the relationship between the way communities live with those animals and their involvement in their conservation. So it's trying to sort of broaden the understanding of what it means to conserve and protect beyond the idea of fences, beyond the idea of fortress ecology, fortress conservation, as Dan Brockington called it. And to show how there's been a hell of a lot of thought and political pressure applied to these solutions, especially in a place that was as traumatic as South Africa, where certain racial groups were excluded from the whole of conservation until 1994. So it's an attempt to really reset the idea of conservation in new terms, especially along what I would call the axes of the social ecological, where it's impossible to understand the ecological out of the context of the social and vice versa. So that's the general purpose. And then to give students an intimate understanding of some of the projects we worked on, which continue to be run by these remarkable young Africans who are making a difference globally, I think. So those are some of the goals.
That's amazing. We've talked a little bit about it before this, but what are some of the things that you've seen in your lifetime that have changed conservation-wise or just environmentally?
That's a good question. I suppose what's important for me is that I did this transition out of the arts and humanities and the social sciences more into the hard sciences. So I really began looking at conservation in South Africa from the perspective of someone who is interested in political geography and environmental history. A lot of what I did had to do with the history of conservation and apartheid. And I think that for me, one of the most revelatory, if you want to put it that way, one of the most extraordinary experiences was to meet some of the older black game rangers and field rangers who were never appreciated, who never formed part of the archive of heroism for conservation, whom I was able over the years to get to know and interview, and in one case to make a documentary film about. Now these are extraordinary people, and they changed my conception of how conservation worked. These were the foot soldiers who were also at the same time the most knowledgeable people. These are people with extraordinary naturalist knowledge of tracking, of plant and animal use, of animal behavior, And these are people who served for very little recompense for decades and decades. The one person I had most to do with and interviewed, several of them are now dead. One of them, a brilliant man named Charlie Nkuna, lost his daughter while he was living in the Kruger National Park. His daughter was killed and eaten by a lion. And after that catastrophic event, he found the head of his daughter. He was tracking along and found the head of his daughter and bloody remains. No father should ever have to go through that. Despite that trauma, he remained within the National Park Service for another 20 years. So it's that sort of commitment that actually helped me understand the complexity of social relations with respect to conservation organizations and protected areas. That was the one big thing that influenced me. And the influence also came from my own political involvement in the anti-apartheid movement. The second thing that I have been very privileged to see is what one might call the collapse of the fences. That over the years, the Kruger National Park has opened its boundaries to Mozambique and now to Zimbabwe. I'm going to be very involved in a project which relates to the extension of the Kruger National Park into Zimbabwe over the next few years. And to see areas that had been, or migratory patterns, for example, of elephant and other animals being opened up again into Mozambique from this very long, narrow, gigantic but long and narrow north-south axis. Kruger National Park has been fascinating. And then in more general terms, just the change from pure conservation biology in the focus that people had in management to a more social and ecological understanding of the way conservation works and the complexity theory itself, adaptive management, I think has been the biggest change of all, where conservationists, managers are now emphasizing learning by doing, knowing that they're going to make mistakes, knowing that there are no final answers. And the people I know, the friends of mine who manage the Kruger National Park, I think are exemplary of some of the best of those practices. It's widely studied. There are at least 20, 30, 40 PhDs written about adaptive management in the Kruger National Park. It's benchmark conservation. So those are a few of the things that I've come to understand. There's one final thing, though, that I've come to believe very strongly. The last 10 years of my life have been very difficult in some ways because of my engagement with questions of rhino poaching. And I've come to believe out of that there is no solution to the issue of extinction and what is facing so many species right now. The disappearance of their range, the forced, the fact that they're forced to make altitudinal shifts to accommodate climate change and those sorts of things. But there is no solution, I think, to these questions of extinction and catastrophe without the inclusion of humans. We cannot do it through simply manipulating ecosystems and protected areas. And that's been a very important part of what has driven my life, especially in an era where in the United States we've seen a daily rollback of everything that's dear to me in respect of anticipating climate change, of working towards the preservation of species in collaboration with human beings. It's a very sad horizon that I find myself facing now in the United States.
You mentioned like a few issues on the later part of that answer. What are some of the ways that people could make those make them more prevalent? Sort of ways that they can speak out about those.
I think that I've always taken you'll appreciate my use of this term, Sean, because of our class. I've always taken a utopian view of things, that essentially, no matter how bleak things might appear on the surface, it's necessary, my political sensibility tells me, it's necessary to take the most positive view of the long term in order to act in the present as though we have hope in the future. For me, I think one of the most critical things I would say to students, young activists, people like that, is to try and move beyond making it a question of identity politics only. Try and move beyond making it a question of support for the preservation of charismatic species, and try to organize around some of these issues. So you remember, you're a very active member of a bird club, those sorts of things. As small as that, this is all a question of scale. You can't do it alone, and one sure way to depression is to try and save the rhino alone. Join groups, form political organizations, vote the people out of power who are the enemies of complex conservation. You're the generation, I know you get sick of people saying this, but you really are the generation which is confronting it most directly in its full nuanced complexity. So I would think organizing is a really important thing to do. With respect to conservation itself, I think it's necessary that we all start to interact with the major influential non-profit organizations like Conservation International, the World Wildlife Fund, the Nature Conservancy, all of these people, and insist always that the solutions are never just in the expansion of protected areas, or the protection of species, but the relationship of those interventions to the impacts that they will have on humans alongside the areas or living in the areas. Because, again, just to refer to rhino poaching, I think it's really important to move beyond the awful images of bleeding, hornless rhino dying in the wild, a mother rhino with its calf standing next to it dying. Those catastrophic images, to move beyond that to a full understanding of where the solutions might lie. And they don't lie in militarizing the situation. They don't lie in shooting poachers. Because as knowledgeable citizens, I would like you all to help in educating the general public about what a poacher is and what a solution is, because those solutions are complex and they don't involve shooting poor people. So those would be some of my immediate concerns. But just also to be knowledgeable, to enjoy and love places that are so often misrepresented, whether it's Southeast Asia and especially Africa. Africa is way beyond the picture of the small black child with a fly on his face and a teardrop. To move beyond that, to move beyond the kind of missionary interventions in Africa, to the understanding that Africans have so much indigenous knowledge that we can learn from, and if one can educate the general public, involve them in debates about the complexity of local solutions and local people's engagement, I think we'll move far towards a new understanding of conservation.
Thanks, well, I want to say thank you so much for doing this. Do you have any other information you'd like to share?
Well, I think that you need to be supported in your social media ventures. I like these kinds of interventions. And I want to thank you so much for the opportunity. The study abroad program we run is called Communities in Conservation. It's run from Colorado State. We are filling up fast, but if people are interested, they can navigate to the study abroad programs, the international office at Colorado State. And if I just read the look behind me here, the international programs, Communities in Conservation in Kruger National Park, will run next year for 3 weeks. And if there are any CSU students out there who are still interested, we have a few slots left. But otherwise, watch this space. I think we're going to be using social media more and more to try and popularize these issues. We also, it's likely going to get involved more in citizen science programs. So I think there's going to be opportunity for those of you out there to get involved in helping us to identify different events and different animal species as they pop up on the camera traps we are setting. We have a very interesting project with the Lincoln Park Zoo in Chicago, but it's going to need some citizen science interventions. So we hope to open that up to more general support. Last but not least, we have a new non-profit. I say we, but in fact it's students at CSU who started a non-profit called Pivotal Places, which is designed to give young researchers experiences in South Africa, have them return to the United States, and then remobilize and go back and find solutions to problems of water and conservation, rhino poaching, all of these things. So, there are opportunities for involvement in Pivotal Places as a platform, for donations, for support to young researchers, and support eventually to those real heroes of conservation who are the communities, not just the individuals, who have to live in really complex ways on the edge of protected areas around the world. So watch pivotal places. Have a look at it online.
Well, thank you so much.
My pleasure, Sean. As usual, it's wonderful to chat to you, and I think your work is amazing. So, as they say in the struggle in South Africa, we used to say, "Our luta continua," the struggle continues, it never ends.
Have a great day, and I hope you guys enjoy the video, and I will see you next time.